Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. This week on the show, we are discussing the surprisingly fascinating science of roadkill, wildlife crossings, and the impact of roads on deer and other wildlife. And I'm joined by author Ben Goldfarb. All right, welcome back to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by First Light. And today, we are discussing the surprising, the interesting, the fascinating intersection of roads and wildlife. And there's a little bit of a pun there, but I'm joined today by Ben Goldfarb. He's the author of a terrific book called Crossings: How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. And this book and our conversation today is all about this very interesting set of ways that roads impact deer and other wildlife. And by way of that, they impact us too, as hunters. There are the obvious ways, where roads actually kill wildlife, roadkill, of course, and the many ripple effects of that. And then there's this kind of wider set of like halo effects of roads and how they impact human behavior, pressure on hunting pressure and other types of pressures on wildlife. The ways roads impact pollinators and birds and all sorts of different habitat related things. There's lots of stuff here that's surprising, that's eye-opening, and very relevant to, I think, a lot of folks in the hunting world. Impacts on migration corridors, impacts on wildlife travel, impacts on the genetic viability of certain species as roads are kind of carving up and fragmenting wildlife habitat more and more. So all of that and more is what we cover today with Ben. It's a really interesting and unique conversation that I'm excited for you guys to hear. Before we get to that, very quickly, I just want to plug, leaving a review for this podcast and subscribing if you haven't done yet. And then finally, also checking out the rest of the MeatEater podcast network. We've got shows like, the MeatEater flagship show, but then Cal's Week in Review, God's Country, This Country Life, Bear Grease, The American West with Dan Flores, and several more. I think I'm forgetting something here, but we've got lots to listen to after this chat with Ben Goldfarb. So let's get into it. All right, joining me now is Ben Goldfarb. Welcome to the show, Ben.
Thanks a lot, Mark. It's great to be here.
I really appreciate it. I'm excited about this one. My pal, Ben O'Brien, maybe, I don't know, you're going to have to fact check me on the dates here, but 7 or 8 years ago, something like that, first introduced me to you through your first book, Eager, about beavers, which I thoroughly enjoyed.
Thanks.
And I followed you and kind of your work ever since from afar. And when your latest book, Crossings, came out a couple of years ago now, I feel like it was. Isn't that right? Has it been out 2 years now or a year and a half?
Yeah,
something like that?
2023.
Okay. So when that came out, I immediately put that on my list of, oh yeah, I have to read that book. Because it's right up my alley, that kind of intersection of kind of wildlife and conservation and ecology and all those kinds of things. And, both in line with what I personally am into. And then also, my work life with hunting and writing about those things. But I saw right away that it was a book that would be very relevant to a book project of my own that I'm writing right now. And so I put it on a different reading list. So rather than just the reading for fun list, it got put on the, you need to read that while taking notes list. and so because of that, it kept getting pushed back and delayed and delayed and delayed. So this is a very long and roundabout way of saying, Ben, that as soon as your book came out, I was like, I need to read that. But because of my weird process, I didn't read it until just a month ago while on our family spring break trip. So I finally got around to reading Crossings. And as soon as I did, I realized that just as I thought, it would be a very worthy read. So congrats on a great book. Right out the gate, Ben. Just got to say that. Well done.
Thanks for saying that. And I hope it checked that fun to read box as well as the note-taking box.
It did. And that's that's a sweet spot that's not easy to achieve. Being able to write something that's both really informative and a page turner, and enjoyable, compelling. That's no easy task. So nicely done. You were able to survive the sitting by the pool with a beer test, and I did not fall asleep.
Oh man, it's me, John Grisham, and Stephen King in that category. So.
That's quite the company to keep, Ben.
That's right. Hey, thanks a lot.
but I want to quickly make this relevant to people listening, because this book is about something that you call road ecology, which to the average outdoors person might sound kind of jargony and maybe not relevant to what a hunter or angler might care about. But I guess to open it, tell me this: what's road ecology, and why should a hunter or angler or outdoorsman care?
Sure. So road ecology is basically this relatively small, but I would say fast growing field of science that looks at all of the different ways that roads interact with and connect with nature and often fragment nature, right? And, I think from a hunter's perspective, of course, that dead deer by the side of the highways is the most visceral, obvious connection. A couple million large animals at least are killed in wildlife vehicle collisions every year, and that's a tremendous loss to hunters. I mean, from a fish perspective, I'm not a hunter, but I'm a pretty avid angler, and every place that a stream goes under a road, there's a culvert, and often those culverts are too small or defective, and that's a huge loss of fish migration and fish and aquatic connectivity and habitat. So road ecology basically looks at all of these different points that roads and ecosystems intersect and thinks about, okay, what impacts are roads causing on nature? And I think really importantly, what do we do about those impacts? How do we start to solve some of the ecological problems that our massive 4 million mile transportation network here in the US creates?
Yeah. In your book, you write about, I believe this is a quote, as long as I didn't mess up my transcription. You wrote the pavement itself blankets less than 1% of the United States, yet its influence, the road effect zone, to use ecological jargon, covers a full 20%. So you mentioned the fact that there's like a 4 million mile road network across the country. But then here you talk about how the effect of roads expands beyond just that 4 million actual miles. But then there's also this buffer, outside of that. Can you explain a little more of what the road effect zone is and what that means? Because I kind of want to lay the groundwork here for just how far reaching roads really are.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that historically a lot of conservation groups and even wildlife biologists have, I think, overlooked roads as this ecological problem is because, as you say, they don't actually cover a lot of land area, right? A road might only be 100 feet wide, let's say, if we're talking about a big highway from shoulder to shoulder. And so what's the big deal, right? There are tens of thousands of acres of habitat out there, but those roads and the traffic that goes along them prevent animals from reaching that habitat, right? There's a really famous map. Maybe we can include it in the show notes or something. This great graphic of a grizzly bear's attempt to cross I-90 in Montana, and that bear is just bouncing, and you can basically see the satellite collar map of this bear's movements, and the bear is just bouncing off I-90 like a ping pong ball, right? He keeps trying to find places to cross the highway, but the traffic is so dense that he's unable to do it. And so that bear attempts more than 40 crossings over the course of 6 months before he finally,
Wow.
Finds his way across the highway somehow. So, from that bear's perspective, right, he's looking at the road. The road is only, 100 feet wide from shoulder to shoulder or whatever, but it's denying him access to hundreds of thousands of acres of habitat, throughout the northern Rockies, right? So, I think that's a really important concept that, you have the impacts created at the level, at the spatial extent of the road itself, right? Again, that dead buck by the side of the highway. But what we don't see is all of the animals who can't complete their migrations, find food, find mates, who are being genetically fragmented by roads. So, that's another thing that road ecology tries to do, I think, is take this broader perspective on the impacts of roads that kind of transcend the relatively limited spatial area of the highway itself.
And another thing that you write about that I've also seen personally is the the tag along with roads, which is people. So wherever
Yeah.
you put people or wherever you put roads, you add people to the landscape. You create a human presence and pressure on wildlife, and so you get animals avoiding roads because of that typical human activity there. So you get as a hunter, we see this all the time as we're trying to figure out, well, where are we going to find the animals? One of the first things you look at is, well, where's the farthest I can get from a road?
Yeah.
And that's the same thing that a deer or an elk or a bear is thinking too, right? So every time a new road is punched in, you lose a little bit of that sweet spot. And as I've seen maps like this where they show all the different roads crisscrossing, and you can find the actual area of zones. Like I don't know what the actual number is, but I know that the farthest you can get from a road anywhere in the lower 48 is not that many miles from a road. And there are not many places you can get more than 5, 10, 12 miles away from a road in any direction. And that's in the wildest places we have left. Most spots, you're always within a mile or 2 miles. And critters react to that. Critters behave differently because of that. Some species simply can't exist because of that. So there's this far-reaching set of weird things that come along with them. Poachers on top of hunters, on top of all the other things that could possibly tag along too. So it's invasive species. We bring all sorts of critters with us along the roads too. There's a lot that I don't think many of us think about, but
Totally
is present.
Yeah,
throughout.
yeah, absolutely. And I think, to your point about, about animals, especially ungulates, responding to those roads. I mean, I was talking in the course of working this book, I talked to a Forest Service biologist in Eastern Oregon, and she told me this, kind of amazing story. In the Forest Service, of course, this incredible steward of public lands, right? But also has the single largest road network on Earth. Something like 370,000 miles of road in our national forests. I mean, there are forests in Idaho and Montana that have higher road densities than New York City, right? And all of those,
Wild.
it's crazy, yeah. And so all of those roads, of course, are how we access nature. And I love driving on forest roads out here in Colorado, right? That's how I reach fishing holes and trailheads and all kinds of great stuff. But the animals are smart, and they know that hey, especially during hunting season, the roads bring the cars bring the people bring the sticks that go bang and kill you. What this biologist was telling me is that actually in Eastern Oregon, what she's seen is a lot of elk leaving public land and ending up on private land where hunters can't access them at all, because those elk recognize that those really dense road networks on public land and the people that come with them are a threat to them. And so from a hunting standpoint, I think it's probably a double-edged sword in that roads permit access to an extent, but as you say, they also create tougher hunting conditions in a lot of respects, and really provoke this kind of aversive response in a lot of animals.
Yeah. So roads have far-reaching, surprising impacts on wildlife. I feel like we've established that. The obvious one of those impacts is simply killing animals, like roadkill, car-deer collisions. And in the introduction to your book, that first chapter, you kind of discuss how roadkill is now the leading direct cause of mortality in land-based mammals. So that more animals die from cars than do from any other direct, impact.
Yeah.
They are also one of the most dangerous animals, or deer, excuse me, are one of the most dangerous animals to people because of road car vehicle collisions. Can you discuss a little bit more that direct impact? Roadkill with deer and other big critters, and how that's both damaging our property, hurting deer and wildlife populations, and also a lethal issue for humans. That's kind of a double whammy across the board there of problems.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you're right that the white-tailed deer is the single most dangerous wild animal in North America, and that's obviously not the deer's fault, right? That's automotive society's fault. But I do think that goes to show how frequent and problematic these collisions are. More than 400 drivers killed in deer crashes every year in the U.S. And that's probably a dramatic underestimate, right? I've talked to state troopers who say, yeah, oftentimes you get a single vehicle fatal accident where somebody hits a telephone pole or a tree. Well, that was probably swerving to avoid deer or other wildlife, right? The person didn't unfortunately survive to explain the incident, but probably those 400 collisions are a dramatic underestimate of the real scale of the problem. And then you've got the economic impact, that property damage that you mentioned. We know that the average deer collision costs society more than $9,000 in hospital bills, vehicle repairs, insurance costs. The loss to hunters is factored into that equation as well. And obviously, deer aren't the only big critters out there, right? Here in Colorado, we've got elk. The average elk collision costs something like $21,000 per incident. The average moose collision is more than $40,000, right? Because moose are just so huge, of course, and have much higher driver fatality rates. Collectively, all of these large animal crashes are costing the U.S. more than $10 billion with a B every year. And it's one of the few crash types that's really increasing too. We're seeing these incidents become more common, more people driving around the landscape, whitetail populations in many places are increasing, causing more risk, right? So, it's this huge, I think, relatively under-discussed public health and safety problem, as well as, of course, a big ecological problem.
Yeah, so in the hunting world, there's always this rumor that the car insurance lobby is working behind the scenes trying to knock down the deer population. So there's people in the state capitol telling our fish and game departments, like, kill all the deer, et cetera, et cetera. That's like one of the old wives' tales within the hunting world I've heard. From your research and in your experience as you were diving into this, did you learn anything about how insurance companies are in any kind of way dealing with the roadkill issue, addressing the roadkill issue, advocating for solutions to it? Is that something that ever came up in your explorations?
Yeah, it's funny. People often ask that, and it is this really intuitive, logical connection, right? And in my experience, they haven't really gotten involved in this issue at all. I've seen an insurance company or two say the right things about the importance of preventing this, but I've never really seen any insurance company, put their money where their mouth is. There was unfortunately here in Colorado, there was a proposal, a bill that just failed, at least for now, that would have added, I think, something like $3 to annual insurance premiums. And that money would have gone partially towards, funding wildlife crossings and fences and other, roadkill mitigation systems. And I think AAA and maybe an insurance company or two, again, said the right things about supporting that bill, although it didn't ultimately pass. But I would love to see the insurance industry getting more involved in, funding those wildlife passages and solutions and fences and other solutions, because they're the beneficiaries, right? When those deer collisions decrease. So if there are any insurance executives listening to this podcast, you should get on that, right?
Yeah. So something that was interesting, you mentioned how we're having more car deer collisions now than ever before. But at one point within the book, you wrote about the fact that, there's a certain number of, like, as you were kind of writing about the history, and as the road system was built out, simultaneous to that, the whitetail deer population was growing. And so we were seeing car deer collisions rise and rise and rise. But then at some point, it actually slowed down, and we started having less collisions and fewer crossings because there was like a threshold pass where there was so much traffic that it was actually keeping animals from even trying to cross over the road. And I know that there were some other interesting studies in science that you had pointed to that kind of showcase like a certain number of cars per hour or during a certain amount of time, might allow certain animals to cross, but others wouldn't. Can you just elaborate a little bit on some of the things you found when it came to that? What degree of traffic actually impacts animal crossings, and things along those lines?
Yeah, absolutely right. So, so I think it's important first to think about how different species understand traffic and what roads are, right? So, there are road ecologists who kind of classify animals based on their road response. And so, on one end of the spectrum, we've got animals who are non-responders to traffic, right? Animals who don't really understand what traffic is and will just try to cross the road no matter what. And there, we've got animals like frogs and salamanders and turtles, maybe not like the smartest critters on earth, don't really understand, what a car or a road is. And those animals are just trying to cross the road to, get to their breeding ponds and wetlands no matter what. And they're just getting crushed en masse, right? So those are the non-responders. Then we've got on the other end of the spectrum the avoiders, animals who really do understand that roads and vehicles are dangerous and will just steer clear. So like grizzly bears are sort of the classic avoider, where even one car every 10 minutes, a really rural road in some cases is enough to prevent a grizzly bear from crossing altogether. And that creates its own problems, right? Those animals are really easily fragmented by traffic. And then deer are somewhere in the middle, and they're what scientists have called speeders, which basically means that they're looking for gaps in traffic that they can just run through, right? And humans are also speeders. You can imagine like standing by the side of a busy highway. You're looking both ways, waiting for that gap between vehicles that will let you run through traffic to get to the other side. And that's exactly what deer are doing. They understand the cars are dangerous, especially ones living in relatively urban places. And they're just trying to get through that wall of vehicles. So you can imagine, right, at lower traffic volumes, a relatively rural road, the cars are infrequent enough that they can run through those gaps. If you have a really busy interstate highway like I-80 or something, the cars are so dense that there are no gaps, right? And the deer don't even attempt to cross. The highest roadkill rates that we see are on moderately trafficked highways. Like typically we're talking about state highways that are getting let's say 5,000 cars a day. That's when there are enough cars for it to be dangerous, but few enough cars that the deer are still trying to run through those gaps, right? So along that's kind of one of the ironies of the the interstate highway system, is that along some interstates you really don't see a lot of roadkill, right? Because there's just so much traffic that the deer and other animals aren't attempting to run from one side of the highway to the other. And so you might look at the shoulder and not see too many carcasses and say, well, hey, what's the big deal, right? But then that's when you're getting that fragmentation issue, right? The fact that the animals can't move from one habitat to another, they can't find food, they can't find mates, they can't complete those long distance migrations in places like Wyoming and Utah, where animals really do have to move a very long distance to survive. So yeah, that's one of the one of the kind of the ironies, I think, of roadkill, is that a relatively rural road and a relatively high volume interstate highway can have kind of the same low amount of roadkill, but they're animals are experiencing them in very different ways.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things when it comes to you brought up deer a couple times, and like white-tailed deer versus maybe mule deer or other western ungulates. And you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my assumption would be that more white-tailed deer get killed by cars on an annual basis than mule deer or pronghorn or elk. But I'm also assuming that white-tailed deer do not have as large of don't experience as large of a negative impact as a mule deer does, because those roads act as a different kind of blocker for them, despite the fact that maybe 10 whitetails get killed to every one mule deer. Is that true? And if so, why might that be?
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. I mean, first of all, there's just a lot more white-tailed deer in North America than mule deer, obviously. So when you look at the states that have the highest animal collision rates, right? They're generally eastern and midwestern states. It's like West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Montana often kind of slips in there, but they've got some whitetails too. So you're totally right that a lot more whitetails are just being hit by cars. But I also think I would also certainly agree that that cars are having a much bigger impact on mule deer from a population perspective, because again, I mean, in places like Wyoming, in Colorado where I live, these animals are undertaking these really long journeys, right? These really long migrations. It's not like living in Pennsylvania where, the weather's not too harsh and, the mountains aren't too huge and there's kind of, plenty of corn and other anthropogenic, human-based food resources out there for them, right? A white-tailed deer in Pennsylvania can be pretty sedentary, right? And find food year round and, escape the weather. Whereas, a mule deer living in Wyoming, has to complete this really long journey. They're moving from their winter range, these low elevation valleys that get super hot in the summer up into the mountains, right? They're kind of surfing that green wave of new growth. And then they're coming back, there are deer in Wyoming that are going 300 miles round trip between these really ephemeral seasonal resources in this, super harsh Western environment. And of course, the problem is that, if you're going to walk 300 miles anywhere in the US, you're going to end up crossing a lot of roads, right? And in the book, I talk about this very famous herd of mule deer in southwestern Wyoming in the Red Desert. And these are these long distance migrants, and their winter range abuts I-80, right, which is again, of course, the highest volume road in Wyoming, and some years, during those harshest winters, those deer will just pool up on the north side of I-80 looking for an opportunity to cross, and they just can't find one because the traffic volume is so high. And there have been winters where 40% of that herd will actually starve because all of the good forage is south of I-80 and they can't cross that highway, right? So from a population level standpoint, that's probably worse than roadkill, right? That a herd of 1,000 deer, they could handle a few collisions on the highway. What they can't handle is losing access to so much of their winter range, right? I mean, historically, those deer might have gone as far south as Colorado, and now they're stuck up against the interstate. And from a population level standpoint, that's a catastrophe for them.
Yeah. Well, I was traveling out to our cabin in Idaho a few years back. I guess this would have been 2 years ago. And our route takes us along 80 until you hit Rock Springs, and then you hang a north turn up 191, I guess it'd be, heading up into
like Pinedale.
Going towards Pinedale. Yeah,
right.
Going right up towards Pinedale. And along that route, I'm pretty sure this is 2 springs ago or 1 spring ago, all along the road, along all these fences, you would see these white ovals on the ground. And you would see dozens, at times hundreds of them scattered across the sagebrush. And at first, I thought it was patches of snow. And then my son asked what it was. And then I took a closer look, and I realized that what I was seeing scattered all across the sagebrush for miles and miles and miles and miles were the white bellies of dead pronghorn.
Oh, Jesus.
And what had happened is, some people might recall reading about, and again, I'm going to get my year wrong, it was either last spring or the spring before, but there was this mass die-off of pronghorn in that herd that just this year a report came out exploring what exactly was to blame. And there had been some disease issues, and then there was also worries about starvation. And what the study came back and showed was that the vast majority of the deaths could be attributed to pronghorn being hung up by fences, stalled out by not being able to cross the road, not being able to get through the fences, and then being stuck there, not able to finish their migrations, and then ultimately starving. And so between that and the disease pressures, they had, catastrophic losses. I mean, the tens of thousands. And that was a very eye-opening, recent example of exactly what you're talking about. And that's happening, like you mentioned, not just with pronghorn, but mule deer and other critters too. And I was going to ask you, which is worse, the direct roadkill or the stalling of the migration? And you answered that. But I'm curious if you could expand on that just a little bit more when it comes to, how these migrations are impacted by roads and some of the research around that. There's been such interesting stuff, especially in Wyoming, studying, the actual points where these animals want to move through or have to move through, and how there's kind of unique roadblocks built in. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on what migration research and studies now are showing us?
Yeah, for sure. And this chapter of the book is really drawn from the work of the Wyoming Migration Initiative. Guys like Matt Kaufman and Hall Sawyer, who are some of the best mule deer biologists and migration ecologists on Earth. And I had the chance to go out and collar deer with Matt and his crew for a few days, and that was really one of the great experiences of my
That's awesome.
of my life. It was so much fun, and it just gave me so much appreciation for mule deer. These animals that just hang out in my backyard here in Colorado, and try to trample my dog, and we see them all the time, and but we see them during these really limited windows in some ways, right? They show up in our communities, and then we don't see the rest of the migration. But these are animals that are undertaking these incredible journeys. They're doing it with these amazing spatial memories, right? They're great cartographers. They learn their migration routes. They're not instinctive migrators. And so, migration is kind of this incredible cultural phenomenon that herds learn together, and that does teach their fawns. And that's a lot of the work that that Wyoming Migration Initiative has done, is figuring out how these animals understand their migrations and how they time their migrations. And that timing ends up being a really important piece of the puzzle, right? So, the term that that the WMI folks and other biologists use to describe what these deer are doing is they're surfing the green wave, right? There's this wave of green up in the spring that kind of climbs up the slopes, and those animals are following that green up when the plants are the most nutritious and tender, and best for them, because of course a lot of these these migrating deer are pregnant as well, which is just also mind blowing to think about, that these animals are undertaking these journeys while they're carrying their fawns, and so that's really one of the, I think, the underappreciated problems that that roads create, is not only do they prevent animals from crossing, but they can just disrupt the timing of that green wave surfing, right? I mean, those those pronghorn you mentioned, this happens to deer too, where if they're just delayed along a busy highway, they can kind of fall out of sync with that green wave surfing, as I understand it, and that has these really significant sublethal effects, right? Maybe you don't get hit by a car if you're a migrating doe mule deer, but maybe you don't feed quite as well, and maybe your fawn isn't quite as healthy, and can't escape a bear or a wolf as a consequence of that, right? So that's not direct road mortality necessarily, but it's this kind of subtler sublethal effect that can result in in deer really having problems. And I mean, there's been lots of great research. Mule deer are really declining dramatically, in Wyoming and here in Colorado. And I mean, the biggest factor there, according to some studies, is residential development, right? It's all those roads, going into places which are worse for deer than other forms of development, even like oil and gas drilling. It's just the presence of roads and vehicles and subdivisions on the landscape that cut off those migration routes or disrupt their timing, and ultimately lead to population decline.
Yeah. Yeah, we're getting to a point where the natural world has been so crisscrossed with roads and development that not only do we have these like moving fences, as you call them,
right,
but we're creating islands. We're creating metaphorical islands of even though they're not surrounded by water, we're creating wildlife habitat that's surrounded by an ocean of development and roadways, and that has a whole other set of sublethal factors, on top of just the direct mortality, on top of the delayed migrations, on top of everything you just mentioned. This isn't as applicable to mule deer or pronghorns, but with grizzly bears or something like panthers down in Florida, you start dealing with genetic issues, right? Where some of these species are so deterred by roads and development that, like you said, they simply won't cross. So, for example, with grizzly bears, you've got a subpopulation around the greater yellow ecosystem and a subpopulation up in the northern continental.
right.
And you've got, 70 miles between the two, and they just won't cross that last 70 miles because there's too large of roads, there's too much development there, and it's keeping genetics from passing between the two populations and getting the diversity that these species need to maintain long-term viability. Is that something that you learned anything more about through this process too, the genetic implications or any other implications of that kind of island effect that we're seeing happening more and more, not just with big mammals but other critters too?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you're exactly right. You could take a snippet of DNA from a grizzly bear and say with unerring accuracy which side of which highway in the northern Rockies that bear was born on, right? Because those highways, I-90, Highway 2, all of those highways, running east west, through Montana are huge, huge barriers. And I think that's one interesting kind of geographic piece too that I think about a lot is that our mountain ranges in the West tend to run north south, and so do our valleys, which means that animals are often moving north to south, and so many of our big highways, I-90, I-80, I-70, are running east west, right? So we have this inherent conflict where a lot of our transportation routes are at sort of perpendicular odds with our animal movement corridors, which is a huge challenge. And certainly that genetic fragmentation you mentioned. I mean, that's a gigantic issue. One of the poster populations for that, right, are these very famous mountain lions who live in Southern California, just west of Los Angeles. I bet lots of listeners have heard of P22. Probably the most famous mountain lion on Earth while he was alive, and he was part of this little population in the southern Santa Monica's near Los Angeles, where as you say, there's this island of habitat in this ocean of freeways. You've got the 101 and the 405 and the 5, biggest freeways on Earth, running through that landscape. Or sorry, let me take that again, because I actually don't think the 5 goes through there. But you've got the 101, you've got the 405. Some of the busiest freeways on Earth, basically fragmenting that landscape and preventing those mountain lions from dispersing out to find mates. And so, in that little population, scientists have seen individual mountain lions, male mountain lions, who have mated with their own daughters, granddaughters, and great-granddaughters because they just can't find an unrelated animal to mate with. And the other thing that biologists see in that population is lots of fighting between mountain lions, right? Lots of mortality in these lion conflicts because those younger male cats, especially, of course, they want to disperse out, right? They want to get away from their fathers and the other big males to go find their own territory. But if the 101, which has 300,000 cars a day, is in your way, right? You can't go find your own territory, and so you're stuck on this island with all of these these big dominant males, and you end up in conflict. So they see that genetic fragmentation, but also the squeezing of territories and all of this lethal conflict between individual mountain lions because of that fragmentation. So that island effect that you're describing, Mark, is exactly right, and it's a huge problem. We've turned all of our terrestrial landscapes into a series of islands.
I've done a good bit of reading about that same thing happening down in southern Florida in the Everglades, and how that's led to serious inbreeding effects that have led to reduced survival rates of kittens and all sorts of wild things happening down there too. So it's a pathway to slow but certain demise unless something's done about it. So we've talked about the direct impacts of roadkill, like white-tailed deer smashing up cars and getting killed. We've talked about migrations being impacted. We've talked about genetic diversity being hampered. A lot of these things have all been about large mammals, which are the most obvious of animals to be impacted by roadways and our roads. But you spent a good amount of time talking about something much, much smaller, but equally important to a lot of the more charismatic things that we focus on, like deer and the wild places they inhabit, and that being pollinators and insects and butterflies and things like that. Can you speak a little bit about that, how roads might be impacting our insects and why that might be something we should pay attention to as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting, it's kind of a double-edged sword in a lot of ways, because in a sense, roads are habitat for insects, right? You think about states like Iowa or Illinois or Kansas. These aren't states, unlike states in the West, they're not blessed with a huge amount of public land, right? And so, in many Midwestern states, roadsides are actually the largest form of public land. There are these strips of in many cases, native prairie plants that follow highways, and there are these corridors of habitat in this monoculture of corn and soy and lawns, right? So, there is this potential resource there. If you're a monarch butterfly, who has to lay your eggs on milkweed, well, there are hundreds of millions of milkweed stems along roadsides in the Midwest. The monarch butterfly migration, that runs through the Midwest, basically follows I-35, right, from Minnesota to Texas. So there's a great resource there potentially, but it's a dangerous resource, right? Of course, the road's a dangerous place, and millions of migrating monarch butterflies are killed by cars every year. We don't really think about insects being roadkill, right? But it is this enormous source of mortality for migrating monarchs and all kinds of other insects. And then there are all of those chemical effects as well. All of like the road salts being added to highways. What does that do to the nutritional value of the plants that those butterflies are feeding on? What about the cadmium and the zinc and the copper coming off our vehicles and ending up in soils? What does that do to pollinators? So there's the direct mortality of cars, and then there's the kind of the potentially problematic sublethal effects again along roads. So that's not to say that we shouldn't have native wildflowers and milkweed along our roads, right? I mean, I've talked to biologists who have calculated that roadsides are producing more monarch butterflies than they're killing, and that roadsides are ultimately a valuable form of habitat. But again, they're not the best habitat, right? If you said, here's $1 million, you can restore the side of an interstate highway, or you can restore a cornfield far from the highway, I'd restore the cornfield, right? So roads are habitat, but they're a dangerous resource for these critters too.
Yeah, it is really interesting. You've got like an attract and repel effect in that, like, you're attracting a lot of these species there with, I think there's something called, is it the Monarch Highway?
Yeah,
is that a
right.
stretch that you run by, I think, right?
Yep.
Where they're trying to actively plant more milkweed and trying to produce habitat, but then there's this debate about whether or not you're killing more than you're helping. But zooming out now, I feel like there's three kind of hot buzzwords these days related to the solution side, the now what part of this whole conversation. And these three buzzwords that you hear a lot these days, and that seem to have a lot of support, even across the political spectrum, would be corridors, connectivity, and migration routes. If you wanted to like do like a game where you would take various environmental buzzwords and put them into a Venn diagram, where there'd be some people on the left, some people on the right, and then there's like the intersection in the middle. I think those three things would probably meet in the middle of that Venn diagram as something that both sides can generally support. I think as evidenced by the fact that during the first Trump administration, one of the good things that happened for the environment during that period was some progress on wildlife migration, conservation, and some corridor work and things like that. So why do you think that is? Why is there bipartisan support for addressing the issues you're talking about right now?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it is kind of amazing just how bipartisan that support is, and how universal that support is, right? I mean, there's been public polling around wildlife crossings, overpasses and underpasses for big game and other critters, and here in Colorado, I think 85% of residents support more wildlife crossings. You see the same numbers in Oregon and Nevada and all, a bunch of Western states. And, you couldn't get 85% of Colorado's degree that the sky is blue, right? It's just a mind blowing, how universal the desire to reconnect these habitats is. And, I do think that a lot of that actually comes from hunters. You think about Wyoming as a great case study. Wyoming has some of the most and the best wildlife crossings in the country. When you drove up I-90 or 191 past Pinedale, you would have driven under a couple of wildlife overpasses and over, I think, 5 underpasses for mule deer and pronghorn. There are some great underpasses on Highway 30 in Wyoming, in a place called Nugget Canyon, famous mule deer migration corridor. So lots of great examples of animal infrastructure in Wyoming, and so much of that is because it's a state with a really powerful hunting culture and politically powerful hunters as well. One of the great groups who I wrote about in the book is the Muley Fanatics Foundation, a mule deer advocacy group. They were responsible for the creation of a license plate, a special license plate, the revenues from which go to wildlife crossing infrastructure. So yeah, I do think that's the reason that you see people like Ryan Zinke, right, in that first Trump administration, authoring was it 3362 was the secretarial order that required states to identify winter range and migration corridors. So yeah, there's this great bipartisan, really nonpartisan relationship there. John Barrasso, Republican senator from Wyoming, he wrote some of the language that ended up being this big wildlife crossings grant program. He was the first to introduce it in a bill, and now that program exists. So yeah, we live in this hyper-polarized society, obviously, and I think that wildlife crossings are one of the few issues that the hunting lobby and the Humane Society, both vociferously agree upon.
Yeah, I love to see it.
Yeah, for
love
sure.
to see some kind of common ground. It also seems like it's one of those interesting sweet spots in that it's most of these migration or connectivity type initiatives, legislation or executive orders, whatnot, they tend to advocate for targeted protections or targeted crossings, which viewed from one side are like better than like a very far-reaching, wide-ranging set of protections that some people might be worried about impeding development. And then from like the other side, the more protectionist side, which wants to see lots and lots of protection, this is at least we cover the very most important points, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're able to find where these key crossing points are and protect those. So it's some people would view it as the minimum amount they can handle, and some would view it as better than nothing. But one way or another, it is better than nothing. So let's get a little more into the crossing side of things. As you alluded to, like just right there on 191, there's several different forms of crossings being utilized by mule deer and pronghorn. But can you talk us through a little bit of what kinds of solutions have been found for wildlife crossings? And it's pretty wild how many different versions of this there exist. Everything from something that's made to get amphibians across the road to something that's as suitable for a grizzly bear or mountain lion too. So could you kind of expand and explore on what all those things might look like?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that whenever you're talking about wildlife crossings, right, it's important to start with a kind of a fundamental understanding of the biology and ecology of the animal that you're trying to get across the highway, right? So that those 191 crossings by Pinedale, at a place called Trappers Point, that's a really good example of that, because there, you have this ancient migration route for both mule deer and pronghorn. It's just kind of cool from a hunting standpoint, briefly, to think about how long that migration route has existed and how long humans have understood that migration route. Right, there are amazing archaeological finds of pronghorn, that were killed with stone tools, 6,000 years ago in that spot. Right, so I just love that idea.
That fascinated me.
Yeah. So I just love the idea of humans and ungulates kind of moving through the landscape together. from this deep time perspective. So anyway, so you've got these two iconic species both hitting the highway, in the same place. Mule deer are pretty easy animals to get across highways, right? They'll use lots of different crossing types, lots of data that they're pretty happy going through concrete box culverts as long as they're large enough. But pronghorn really don't do that. Pronghorn don't like underpasses, and to understand why that is, it's important to think again about the biology and the ecology of the pronghorn, right? The pronghorn is this incredibly fast animal. Of course, it's the fastest terrestrial animal in North America. It was chased by American cheetahs during the Pleistocene, right? They also have incredible eyesight. One of the farthest seeing mammals on Earth. And so that's an animal that doesn't want to be in a little box culvert, right? That's an animal that evolved to outrun and to detect and outrun its predators in open space. That's an animal that wants to be up on the deck of a bridge, of an overpass, so that it can, scan the horizon for threats and run away if it has to. So there at Trapper's Point, you've got two types of crossings, right? You've got those underpasses that the mule deer readily use, and you've got the overpasses that the pronghorn have a really strong preference for. You see the same kind of dichotomy or division in bears. Black bears are historically kind of forest dwellers who are more comfortable in confined, closed spaces, and they'll use underpasses pretty readily. Whereas grizzly bears are these big, powerful plains animals. Lewis and Clark famously saw them in North Dakota, right? These are prairie critters. They don't want to be in a little underpass. They want to be, again, in an open space, especially those sows with cubs, because sometimes the boars, the males, will kill those cubs to put the females back into heat, right? So the females are looking out for males to protect their cubs from them. So so grizzly bears have a strong preference for overpasses, whereas black bears will happily use underpasses, right? So whatever crossing you're creating, you have to begin with that understanding of what your target species is, what sorts of crossings, what kinds of structures will appeal to those animals, and also where those animals are moving through the landscape, right? And that's where the satellite collar data being collected by groups like the Wyoming Migration Initiative can really help, because they tell you that data tells you, okay, here's where the animals are approaching the highway and would use a wildlife crossing if the opportunity presented itself.
Yeah. Now, a lot of the examples discussed when it comes to wildlife crossings come from the West or the North, right? They talk about the parks up in Canada.
Yeah.
They talk about, they're west of Glacier National Park. They talk about, the things there in Wyoming. Right. There's the more recent example down there with the mountain lions in Southern California. But is any of this happening on the east side of the country? Are there wildlife crossings unbeknownst to those of us in the Midwest or the East Coast, where critters of some type are getting across the road in ways that maybe we're just not noticing? Because I'm not seeing big, sexy overpasses in Michigan or New York or North Carolina. But is there something happening there as well?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I think that you're right that historically, Western states really the leaders on this stuff, right? And again, that's just because of the migratory nature of the wildlife, right? If you have a herd of 1,000 mule deer crossing the same highway in Wyoming year after year, pretty soon there's this big pile of carcasses saying, hey, put a wildlife crossing right here, right? Whereas, in the Midwest and the Northeast, those whitetails aren't really migrating in the same way. And it just kind of feels like they're everywhere all the time, right? There aren't hot spots in the same way. And so I think that, historically, Eastern states have kind of thrown their hands up and said, yeah, there's really nothing we can do about this. Wildlife crossings are great for those Western guys, but they don't make sense for our ungulates here. And, fortunately, that mindset is changing. You're right that you don't really see, big, sexy overpasses yet in those Eastern states, but, you do see underpasses. Florida has built lots of underpasses for Florida panthers that you mentioned. A great example that I talk about in the book comes out of Virginia. on I-64, where basically, they'd identified this frequent, whitetail deer collision hotspot. But in that stretch of highway on I-64, there were a couple of culverts, these kind of concrete sided, dirt floored underpasses that beneath the highway, and those weren't built for wildlife, right? I think one was built for a seasonal stream to flow under the highway. One was built for a dairy farmer, I believe, who wanted to, run his cows back and forth under the interstate. So those weren't wildlife crossings per se. But what some folks at the Virginia Department of Transportation realized is that, hey, if we just built fences on either side of the underpass of these culverts, we could make deer and other animals use them, right? Deer would be trying to cross the highway, they'd hit that fence line, they'd follow the fence line, and they'd find that culvert, and they'd go underneath it. And sure enough, that was exactly what happened. So they managed to reduce collisions by more than 90%, and they, saw hundreds, if not thousands, of deer and black bears and foxes and the possums and all kinds of critters going back and forth under that highway. And I think really importantly for the transportation department, that project paid for itself really quickly, right? Because we were talking earlier about how expensive and dangerous all of these animal crashes are. Well, if you put some fencing in that reduces crashes by more than 90%, you can recoup your own costs really quickly, which is, we see frequently with wildlife crossings. So I think that example and a couple of others have helped other eastern states say, wait a second, wildlife crossings are not just for Wyoming and Utah and Montana. We can build them here. And so if you look at, the bipartisan infrastructure law, which had $350 million for wildlife crossings in the form of competitive grants going to states and native tribes and other entities. A lot of that money has gone to Wyoming and Colorado and Utah, but a lot of it's also gone to Vermont and Maine and Massachusetts, which got funding to build a crossing, an overpass over the Mass Pike, which was pretty cool. And we're seeing eastern states and midwestern states like South Dakota and Missouri and Pennsylvania, getting money to begin the planning process for wildlife crossings. Right here in the West, we've got lots of shovel-ready projects. We have all this data. We know where the migration corridors are, where the collision hotspots are. We're, ready to build, $15 million overpasses today, whereas a lot of the eastern states are, a few years behind, and they're saying, okay, now we have a desire to do this. We want to build wildlife crossings, and let's figure out where to put them. Because it turns out that there are hot spots out there. It's not just a whitetail free for all.
Yeah. So zooming out a little bit more, if crossings get an animal across one road from habitat A to habitat B, you might be able to zoom a little bit further out and look at something that a lot of folks refer to as corridors, which would be these larger protected zones to some degree that connect habitat to habitat to habitat, allowing wildlife species to do something like we talked about earlier, which might be connect one genetic subpopulation to another, or to be able to migrate, or to be able to adjust to a changing climate, or adjust to new development pressures. And there have been discussions around these in different parts of the country. Like there is a corridor type project in Florida where they're trying to connect habitat from the southern tip of the state towards the panhandle, trying to protect places along that route along with crossings. And then there's, some big, more well-known ones out west. You talked about this a little bit in the book. You led towards the beginning with how the Yellowstone to Yukon corridor kind of opened your eyes to this whole idea of crossings. Can you elaborate a little bit on this idea of corridors, the importance of it today, and maybe speak a little bit about why, since that one is so well known and compelling?
Yeah, for sure. And that was really the project that got me excited about this topic. 12 years ago now. So yeah, I think it's important to remember, of course, that roads don't occur in isolation, right? As you allude to, they're part of this much larger landscape, and you have to think about habitat protection and wildlife crossings going hand in hand, right? And I know you're a big public lands guy, Mark, which I really appreciate. You have to have public lands or some other form of protected habitat on either side of the road, right? If you and look, we see that here in the West all the time, where if you have a wildlife crossing, and you can build a great overpass over a highway. But if the open space on either side of that overpass gets turned into condos tomorrow, you've got a bridge to nowhere, right? And so
Yeah.
conservation easements and other forms of land protection have to go hand in hand with the construction of those wildlife passages. And so that's what we start talking about, right? Those larger corridors, those larger connected and protected spaces. And it doesn't necessarily mean public land. It could mean a big ranch with a conservation easement on it, right? That prevents that open space from turning into subdivisions. In many places it means fence removal, right? You talked about those pronghorn earlier, which are a great example of a species that has a really hard time crossing fences. They don't jump as well as elk and deer do, and so they really get hung up by those fences. And so if you have a wildlife overpass, but a whole crap load of barbed wire on either side, that's going to be a big problem for pronghorn. Another big piece of all of this, especially when you're talking about large carnivores, is conflict mitigation, right? Figuring out how to protect livestock and other forms of agriculture from wolves and bears and cougars and coyotes, right? I mean, again, same principle. A grizzly bear can cross an overpass over the highway, but if on the other side he ends up killing a few sheep and getting shot for it, you haven't really achieved connectivity, right? So
Right.
these broader corridors like the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, they take this really holistic perspective on all of the different barriers to movement that are out there on the landscape. So wildlife crossings are part of the story, but certainly not the entire story. And Y to Y is a great example of that, because they do take that bigger synergistic vision. I mean, really their goal is to create ideally a connected wildlife corridor that runs from the Yukon all the way to Yellowstone National Park, so that really far-ranging animals like grizzlies and wolverines and wolves and caribou can move through this connected landscape. And again, that doesn't, certainly those big protected areas, those big blocks of public land like Glacier National Park, like Banff and Jasper in Canada, that's part of the story. But that corridor also goes through ranches and farms and and industrial timberlands and all sorts of of quote unquote working lands. And conflict mitigation in those spaces is part of it too. So again, just thinking about all of those different barriers on the landscape and how we can address them synergistically, I think, is really where this corridor movement is going.
So I'm curious, Ben, as you have, well, let me take some different approach. As I have learned more and more about the various topics that are related to conservation and public lands and the future of wildlife, as I've worked on various projects on my own, I find myself having two parallel energy kind of sources, or like maybe you could think about like a devil on one side and an angel on the other shoulder. And the more I learn, I will have this devil on one shoulder that's saying, look at how screwed everything is.
Yeah.
And look at all the bad stuff that's happening. And look at all these depressing statistics and all of this bad news and dire straits for this critter or this place. And then on the other hand, on the other shoulder, the more I learn, the more I also find out about or hear from, encouraging examples of good people doing great work, helping out in specific locations or discovering new ideas or, banding together and achieving important progress in protecting wildlife or installing some kind of new conservation practice or whatever it might be. So I'm constantly kind of oscillating between those two things, the deeper and deeper I get into all this. So my question for you is, as you worked on this project, Crossings, as you dove into the world of road ecology and wildlife corridors and crossings, where do you stand today on those parallel tracks of good energy and bad energy, the devil and the angel on the shoulder? Are you hopeful? Are you disheartened? What's your view for the future?
Dude, you just described exactly my internal conflict. The oscillation, the oscillation between hope and despair is it's
Yeah.
so real. And I think that, like any thinking, feeling, ecologically minded person can probably relate to that. I mean, on one hand, I do feel a lot of hope. As we were saying earlier, this is truly a bipartisan issue, the need for wildlife crossings and corridors. And there are, I mean, so many fantastic projects springing up all over the place. I mentioned those mountain lions in California earlier as kind of the poster population for the genetic fragmentation that ROS can create. Well, guess what? There's the largest wildlife overpass in the U.S. is being built right now that will cross the 101 and let those cats move back and forth, and not just mountain lions, but also mule deer and bobcats and coyotes and all
Yeah.
kinds of critters. So there are projects like that provide me lots of hope and are really sustaining. But then of course we know as you know all too well and are writing a book about, we're in the middle of this sixth mass extinction event in our planet's history, and not just extinction, but also common animals or once common animals like mule deer becoming increasingly scarce. Pronghorn, another great example of this animal. It's just sort of like terminally afflicted by fragmentation all across the American West, right? And it's hard to feel like the solutions, such as they are keeping up with the pace of those declines, right? They're not really, and now, unfortunately, we're entering this political period that I think is going to be really hostile to conservation. And I mean, I don't think we can, we know that from what this administration's already doing, and I'm sure you've got listeners, on all sides of the political spectrum, but I look at this administration's desire to sell off public land and develop housing on a lot of it and roll back so many of the protections under the Endangered Species Act. And it's whatever you think about about the Trump administration, it's hard to imagine a world in which it's going to be positive for wildlife, right? So yes, there are these points of political consensus and bipartisanship in the world of wildlife crossings and habitat corridors, but ultimately it's hard to look at the next few years and feel really optimistic about where we're going from a conservation standpoint.
So all that said, what do we do? What kinds of things did you find coming out of this project that you felt that you could take as an individual to make any kind of positive progress? What can we as listeners do? If any of this intrigued us and we thought to ourselves, man, I would love to somehow support this kind of work getting done, more crossings being created, more corridors being protected with easements or whatever other tool. What's your take on what individuals can do to be a part of these solutions?
Yeah, I think this is one of those great issues where doing the classic good citizen of a democracy thing, writing to your elected officials, your representatives, supporting groups that support this stuff, groups. I mean, and that's, I mean, one of the great things about, and one of the reasons I was, really excited to, to talk to a kind of a hunting audience is that, I mean, again, hunters have just been a fantastic community for this issue, right? And I mentioned Wyoming, but also groups like Backcountry Hunters and Anglers is creating this issue. The National Wildlife Federation, and so on. There are so many organizations now, that work on this stuff, and again, because this is relatively nonpartisan, and it's a thing that politicians and transportation agencies like doing, right? There's you build a wildlife crossing and there's a ribbon to cut. It's a fun media friendly event. Transportation agencies can get fantastic trail cam footage of animals using their new wildlife crossings and have it go viral on social media, right? And sometimes I feel kind of cynical about those transportation agencies at times, right? It's like, okay, you love talking about the wildlife crossings you've built, but not about all of the ones you should have built.
Right.
But it is true that that this is one of those multi-win issues that that agencies and politicians want to be part of, and so writing and calling your legislators, really does make a difference. And again, supporting those groups that are working on this issue at a state or federal policy level is also a big win too, because we do see lots of states, states like Utah and Oregon and New Mexico, states on every side of the political spectrum, right? Passing bills that allocate new funding towards the construction of wildlife crossings and the conservation of corridors. So, and those states were all influenced, by groups like the Muley Fanatics Foundation, right? Hunting groups and other stakeholders. So yeah, just do the good citizen of a democracy thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those things that never gets old. It's going to be one of those deals. You hear about it, but you just have to keep on working on it. You just have to keep pushing that Sisyphusian boulder up the mountain, and keep on making the phone calls and sending the emails, and slowly but surely that stuff builds up into something that decision makers can't ignore.
Yeah.
So
that's the hope for sure.
What, I guess, two things here to wrap things up. Number one, can you preview for us anything coming in the future, any fun new projects, anything we can look forward to? And then, I guess answer me that. Is there anything you can tell us about the future yet, or is that still hush hush?
Yeah, no, for sure. I'm writing a book right now about fish movement, kind of the aquatic counterpart to crossings in some ways. Fish movement as this kind of keystone ecological and cultural force that, with ungulate migration, we've screwed up in a million ways and are now called upon to protect and restore and understand. So, projects like the famous Klamath Dam removal, where 4 dams are just taken out to, permit salmon migration into 400 miles of, newly open river habitat. Projects like that are going to feature prominently in this book, but it's also mostly an excuse to go fishing and see fish in lots of cool places. So it's my thinly veiled angling project.
Smart man. I as I mentioned before we started recording, the last portion of my book that I'm wrapping up now is about salmon, and so I've spent a lot of time over recent months reading about Columbia River Basin and Snake River salmon and all of that. And then last year I got to go up to Alaska and spend time in the Tongass, where there's all sorts of talk about culvert issues there. Yeah. And then, of course, getting to go to a place that doesn't have these connectivity issues yet, like Bristol Bay.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're going to have a lot of fun with that project. I can't wait to read that one.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But we've got to wait a while for that one. But there are 2 books people can read right now. Where would you like to send folks to pick up a copy of any of your previous books?
I always love when people support their local independent bookseller. So see if they have Crossings or Eager in stock there, and if not, order them through your local indie. But if not there, they're available in every online retailer where books are sold. So thank you in advance to all you out there for supporting. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and do you like people to connect with you on social media or a website or anything else like that?
Yeah, sure. My website is just bengoldfarb.com, and I'm active on Instagram and Twitter, and increasingly Blue Sky, and all the other places where writers are now obligated to have social media presences.
Awesome. All right, Ben. Well, I will be impatiently waiting for the 3rd book. Can't wait for that. And in the meantime, I will just send you my thanks one more time for doing some really important work. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Mark. Thanks for having me, and congrats on your own next book. I'm really stoked to read it.
Thanks. If I can survive this next month, we'll hopefully have something to show for it.
Good luck.
Thank you. All right, and that's going to wrap it up for us today. Thank you for joining me. I appreciate you being here for this conversation. And until next time, stay wired to hunt.